Hi, Professor. This is my presentation for my signature assignment. I did it on equity of access to quality education in Finland, Singapore, and the United States. So to start off, obviously the US being one of the countries that I did, and the other countries that I chose to look at were Finland and Singapore. When I started the research on these, I think the most interesting thing about them is that they are two of the top countries in terms of international testing. As I started looking at it, if you see here, right, the inhabitants are similar. I think really there's some good comparisons that can be made with the fact that Finland is seen as more ethnically homogeneous and Singapore is more ethnically diverse. And I think you can see that with the languages, with the official languages in Sweden, in Finland as Finnish and Swedish. Also, there's the Sami language, but not official. But then if you see with Singapore, right, with four different languages, I think that shows it's a very, very diverse country. And then two other things that would be there to be able to, with the juxtaposition and look at the differences, with the no standardized testing in Finland versus the high stakes testing that's in Singapore. I think those things make for an interesting comparison. Some of the similarities that are going to be seen here, the fact that they both have highly educated teachers and high amounts of teacher training. And then another thing that's going to be a difference is going to be the autonomy of the curriculum, where I think in my paper I talk about how I keep saying Sweden, pardon me, where Finland went through a couple different changes in their system, where they had more central control, and then they moved to more autonomy for teachers and schools and local areas. You see Singapore has a lot of central control, so I think the differences in the systems of the more local and regional control for Finland, that's one way. And then for Singapore, another way is the strict control where the government controls the curriculum and the teachers teach that curriculum and the students learn that. But I think both of those, obviously, I think one of the issues that I've been having throughout the course was that I keep trying to compare things as better or worse. And now we're just looking at, especially for these, even though you could look at things that I might think are better or worse, I think the comparison shows that they're both doing a quality job of education. So my research question: how do Finland, Singapore, and the U.S. deal with issue of equity of access to quality of education? That's something that I looked at through each of these. Um, Before I get into that, so a couple key pieces of research that I found. The one thing that really hit me was in the Bignolden Gaiden text. Finnish education is designed to support the development of pupils as human beings and their growth into ethically responsible members of society and the promotion of learning and equality as a society. I think for me that just really sums up the Finnish mantra. And if you look at the way that they talk the talk and they walk the walk with all of their policies of equity, I think that's something that's awesome. Really looking at Singapore, if the issues of student tracking, I think being a challenge to equity of educational access, because it can be argued that sorting students into different groups based on perceived ability can impact teachers' perceptions of student aptitude based on race, class, or any other factor. Finland does it one way and Singapore does it the other way. I think one thing that I kind of contended throughout this is that the United States is somewhere in between, right? It's like we do kind of have tracking through the idea of AP classes and certain levels of classes that students take. Well, it might not be the same as it was in the 1950s and 60s. We still have certain students are getting higher education based on AP, and then other students are having other types of remedial classes or college prep classes where all that stuff comes into the testing, right? So for us in the United States, high stakes testing, I mean, you have to pass the SAT, and you have to you have the PSAT and then the SAT and high test scores to get good marks. All those things are impacting people getting into college. Where I think in Singapore it's crazy how the high stakes testing, it just sets you on to the track that you're going to be, which I guess it's going to work for that society because everyone's going to be able to play a role in that society. Where I don't know if that's really working in our country because really you look at middle class jobs are just gone. nowadays a high school education and really even a college education is not going to. Most people that get out of that are going to have to be trained for something new. So you look at the fact that we need higher skilled jobs, and really the jobs are there for high education, high skill, high aptitude jobs, but it's really leaving everyone else behind. Um, so I think that's an issue of equity of access there. If people just are not being able to reach these kind of heights. But anyways, going back to Singapore, while that is an issue of equity, if people are put on to different tracks where they're not going into the highest careers of politics or business, I guess technically that is an issue of equity. But something that I contended in my paper is that it works for the Singaporean society and may not be transferable outside of the country. And then, going back to Finland there, without high stakes testing and no admissions requirements, I think it's something that creates a beautiful system. But again, that might not be transferable either. For the fact that it's a homogeneous country, and a small country, it works for them, but that would, to adapt that to the United States, it would be a total shift in our whole system. And I don't think that we have the political will for that. Um, So I guess I've been talking about the juxtaposition as well, the high stakes testing in Singapore and Finland not having the standardized testing. Um, and it's tough for the U.S. because we're stuck in between this. And also one thing that I talk about in the paper is federalism and how I say there's 51 different systems. You have 50 states plus the national government and the Department of Education. So 50 different states, a confusing mix of national and state standards, different testing, we're going from No Child Left Behind now to Common Core. And, at my school, we're looking at this and we're just constantly dealing with, what's the next test going to happen? And then now we're moving to becoming a PLC and everyone's just kind of holding their breath for the next thing. So I think that seems to be a confusing thing. One thing that's, I think, huge here that I see with Finland and with Singapore are highly trained teachers. And for me, I really think that if we had a thing where all teachers were, well, there'd be chaos if all teachers were made to have master's degrees. But I think that if you're able to do that, invest in teachers being more professional, then you could, in a way, you could say, well, they're more professional, so we can give them more autonomy. And if you did that and you cut out the testing and you focused on learning, I feel like that's more of a utopian view, but that's something that I think would be better for kids. Um, let's see here. So again, with Finland, with lots of teacher autonomy versus Singapore, that's more centrally controlled. But then again, it still works for both of them. Um, and I think a big thing is for the United States, one of the things that I talked about is that even though we have these goals of democratic equity, it just doesn't really seem to work out. Um, and we do have free K through 12 education, but then I think the variance of that depends on the state that you're in, depends on the county you're in, and the city you're in, and the type of funding that your school gets. Um, and I think I also wrote there in my paper of, if you look at my original question, how do Finland, Singapore, and the United States deal with issue of equity? What I talked about was each state would look at equity different, and then each state would talk about access and quality education. Each of those things can be defined differently in a different state due to the fact that each state has its own standards that sometimes can be conflicted with the federal government. Um, so yes, U.S. and Singapore putting an emphasis on standardized testing. I get it that we all want to get data on our students to find out where to go from there and whatnot. And for our students, getting more data on them allows us to better understand how to better address these issues of equity. But I just don't know if we're equipped to know exactly what to do with that stuff. In college education, I think one thing I talked about with college education is, or I may not have gone into this, but the idea of equity there, the price of college has gone up so much in the last 15 to 20 years that it's priced out those at the bottom. So even if they did have the grades, they're going to get saddled with massive amounts of debt, and that's going to be its own problem. So to conclude here, as I said, the U.S. is kind of stuck somewhere between Singapore and Finland. Our confusing system of federalism, that's just kind of what we have, and there's no way that I don't see a change there. I don't see states giving up their autonomy and their own curriculum and standards. Part of it for me is when I'm looking at the educational establishment, I look at it and say, well, a lot of people get paid for being a consultant here or there, and that's something that's sucking money out of the system. And I think then the interesting thing to gain is that testing isn't everything. I was joking in my staff meeting the other day that I've been more militant with my ideas of like testing and like thing policies that I'd look around and be like, this isn't for the kids. This is stupid. What is this doing? So I've had to find that throughout my master's program, it's made me more opinionated and looking at the things that I believe are best for kids. I look around at a modern day school and you say, what are we doing here? How is this the best for kids? So, um, for me, I think really I look at the Finnish model and I just love it. I just love that idea. It's doing the best for kids, and who cares about the testing? I mean, it's like we're stuck in this matrix of testing is the only thing we know, and it just doesn't have to be that way. And really, on the other side, you look at Singapore and the stress that those students are feeling. I see it every day in my AP kids with my AP kids. The massive amount of stress that they're under. It's really sad. When my kids have a bad day, it's like they're crying and they're crushed, and sometimes I feel like a kid might commit suicide over a test, and I don't think that that's right for kids. And so yeah, I think the U.S. could gain a lot, especially from Finland with the idea of look at starting with healthy kids, right? Kids that are fed, kids that have quality meals, kids that feel loved, and creating a learning environment where they are able to learn effectively because they're fed and they're loved, and they have teachers that are prepared to do the best for them. So I really loved the whole research project. Really loved looking at Finland, and that's something that I might continue to look at more. So thank you very much, and have a great day.